Melanie Addy is married to the perfect guy.
He seemed like husband material. Just a total package, you know?
Molly Watson has found a good catch, too.
She finally found her Prince Charming.
I was numb, I was in shock. That's my husband.
The date has been saved and the invitation sent.
I knew something not right about this guy.
He's the ultimate con man. What's important to him is having power and having control.
Until the groom gets cold feet.
He said she was driving him crazy.
He knew the walls were closing in and had to do something.
I woke up and I smelled gas.
911, what's your emergency? There's a woman laying on the ground in front of a car.
She's been shot execution style.
I think I was supposed to die. I grew up in Paris, Missouri. It's just a really small town, lots of farms. Everybody kind of knows everybody. It's just a very small, rural community.
In the summer of 1994, 22-year-old Melanie Shepard is leading a hectic life, leaving her little time for romance.
I was going to school at College of the Ozarks. I was studying education. I wanted to be an English teacher. I was just really busy going to school and working. I was a cashier at a convenience store. I really didn't date that much.
Everything changes when a 28-year-old mechanic walks into the store one night. His name is James Addy.
There was a long line of people, and he was trying to check out, and he kind of yelled up to the front of the line, "Will you hurry up?" And I just kind of gave it right back to him. I said, "I'm doing the best I can." And he said, "Well, I'm cooking barbecue at my house." And I said, "I don't get any, I don't care." So later that night, he brought me some barbecue. And that's kind of how we met. I thought it was very sweet that he would go out of his way to do that for me. It was very nice. On a busy night, it was a nice surprise.
James returns to the store a week later, and this time, he's not buying groceries.
He asked me to come over, and that was our first date. He cooked supper for me. The food was good, and he's feeding me a lot. So that was kind of fun. We got to know each other pretty well, pretty fast. We both really liked each other. He just seemed like the kind of person that could take care of me and take care of himself and take care of a family. He seemed like husband material. Just a total package, you know?
Not long after they start dating, James drops a bombshell.
He shares with her that he's been married 3 times. So that's kind of shocking for Melanie. 3 times by 28, that's a lot.
He said they were cheaters. They were unfaithful and not good people. They were just gold diggers and trying to take advantage of him and of his good nature and his goodwill.
Despite this awkward beginning, 6 months into the relationship, things are getting serious, and James pops the question.
They were sitting on the couch talking, and he just sort of blurted out, "Will you marry me?"
I said, yes, of course. At that age, you want fairy tales and romance and happy endings. It was fun going to pick out a ring and being engaged. Felt like a grown-up. I felt very confident that I was with a good person. I was with the right person, and he wanted the same things that I did.
In the spring of 1995, James and Melanie get married. The newlyweds seem destined for a happy family life and soon welcome 2 kids.
Just had our perfect little family, 1 boy and 1 girl. I am a nurturing person, and I want to take care of my kids, and I want to take care of my husband, and I want to take care of my house. I think he saw that, yeah, that would work. That would work for him. That would work as a wife and good partner in life. I think that's what he wanted. He was a strong person. He was the protector and very capable of handling life. He was definitely the leader of the family. He took care of business.
In 2004, James takes on a higher-paying job as a prison guard, 30 miles away at the Moberly Correctional Center.
He really liked his job. He really did well in his job. He had no problem telling people what to do or being that aggressive person if he had to be. He could keep people in line. I think it was a real ego boost for him to have people listen to him and jump when he said jump. And then he expected it to happen at home, too. He wanted to have someone just follow along with whatever he said. It was tough because I'm not a prisoner. He didn't like that I had my own opinions, and he would get upset.
After 8 years of marriage and with her children now in school, Melanie looks to pursue her teaching career. But James puts his foot down.
He didn't want me to work. He didn't want me to go back to school. He kept saying, oh no, you need to stay at home. You need to stay at home. He just didn't want me out in the world and, come home and talk about my coworkers and talk about my job. He didn't want that. He wanted me to be focused solely on him. And he got very upset with me. He said I don't support him, and it was a big problem. It was a huge fight. That was very unexpected. I thought we were a team. I thought, we were building this life together, and I was supposed to just leave everything behind and just be his wife now. I didn't like that.
The arguments only get worse. For someone who craves control, James starts losing it.
He could get so mad that he would be threatening and intimidating and throw things. I can remember going through a lot of salt and pepper shakers. I would always just stand there because I don't want to be intimidated. I don't like that feeling. I don't like backing down from that.
11 years into the marriage and desperate for a sense of independence, Melanie finally defies James.
I started working. I was a substitute teacher, which was perfect while the kids were in school. It felt like this is where I should be. This is what I wanted to do. And it was nice to get out. I always said I liked being a stay-at-home mom, but I liked when it ended too. I liked a new thing to do.
For James, I think it was probably very scary. She has priorities and parts of her life that don't center around him anymore. I think at this point in time, James realizes that maybe Melanie is not going to be the submissive wife that he wants.
6 years into his job at the prison, James's work has strangely become all-consuming, and he disappears for longer lengths of time.
He would leave about 5:30 in the morning. It only takes 45 minutes to get there. So he left pretty early. And then he wouldn't get home till about 5 at night. That's 2 hours after his shift ended. I would just question him, why are you always so late? And he was angry with me. He's like, why can't you leave me alone? He would just say, well, I stopped and talked to people, or I went to get gas. Sometimes he'd have to wait on a train to go by. He had all these little excuses. So it was just odd.
There's a reason James is spending longer hours away from home, and it has nothing to do with work. He's spending more and more time with one of the other guards. Her name is Molly Watson.
Molly wanted to get a job that could make pretty good money that she could save back for her and her son you know, so she could go back to school. And so she started out at the Moberly prison. Her ultimate goal was to be a psychologist.
Molly needs the money, as she's a single mom raising her son on her own.
Molly was a really good mom. She gave him all the love in the world.
I am very much a huge geek. I hate being called a nerd.
I wanted Molly to find somebody that respected her for her, that treated her like she deserved to be treated, you know.
In 2011, just a year into her new job, Molly has started dating someone new, and she's excited to introduce him to her brother.
When I first met him, I just kind of looked at him and I was like, hi, you know, I'm Tim. And he's just like, yeah, I'm James. And he put his head down. Just something about him, I didn't like him from the get-go. He was very standoffish. He would never look you in the eye to talk to you. He didn't really seem to care.
James's off-putting demeanor likely raised questions as to who he was, what were his intentions, and really, what was he hiding?
Just something was off about him. I knew there's something not right about this guy.
In 2011, Melanie and James Addy have been married for 16 years. Across town, Molly Watson has fallen hard for the same James Addy.
She adored him. She doted on him. She loved him unconditionally. She made James her #1 priority, and that's what James was looking for. He wanted somebody who put him first, always.
Molly's family is less than impressed with this new man in her life, who's 16 years her senior.
Molly told me he was in the process of getting a divorce, you know, for 6 years, that he had like 2 kids.
He says that he's trying to be there for his kids and do what's best for them, so he's still living with his estranged wife.
I thought that was weird, you know. I've been divorced and I wouldn't live with my ex-wife.
James visits Molly almost every day after work at her parents' house. They spend all their time together in her bedroom.
Molly is living at home with her parents. She's very close with her family. He's not making any attempts to really build a relationship with them. And so it just seems like there's secrets and there's something that's just not right.
He would try to keep her away from everybody. James would try to separate Molly from her son. You could always tell that he did not want Molly's son in their life at all. My dad didn't like him. My mom flat out told me, you know, I don't like the guy. And it killed me to watch my sister keep dating him because, you know, I knew she could do better.
Molly is so enamored with James, she brushes her family's concerns aside.
She was in love. I mean, love is blind, and in her case, that's the truth. You could point out things to her that were obvious and just, she would deny it.
In 2016, 5 years into their relationship, Molly and James take their first trip together.
He received a phone call from one of his friends. He got off the phone and I said, what was that about? And he said, oh, he wants me to go to Mexico with him.
Melanie encourages him to go with his coworkers and have a good time. In reality, James wasn't going with coworkers. He was going to Mexico with Molly, his secret girlfriend. For Molly, this was amazing. She wanted to go on a vacation with James so badly. She was madly in love with him, and this was just an opportunity for them to grow their relationship and spend more time together.
It looked like when they started to go on vacation that they were more committed to each other. You know, like he was maybe getting serious about it. You know, we've had the doubts about him, but okay, maybe this is good.
When James returns home a week later, Melanie notices something odd about his photos.
I said, well, where are the other people that you went with? And he said, oh, I don't want pictures of them. So there was only pictures of him and the resort and the beach. And that's all I saw.
A year later, unbeknownst to Melanie, James takes her to the same vacation spot where he took Molly.
It was so nice. We just had each other and we spent all our time together, and it was a great trip. We had so much fun.
At this point, James has been carrying on this double life for so long that he's gotten so used to it and comfortable, to the point where he's arrogant enough to take his wife on the same vacation he took his mistress.
In October 2017, when James lies and tells Molly his divorce is finalized, she's ready to take the next step.
The only thing she told me about the proposal was that she'd asked James to marry her, and he said yes. Molly looked really happy. You could tell that she was ready to get married.
Now he's got to figure out what he's going to do because he still has a wife.
Molly quickly busies herself prepping for her dream wedding. She picks April 29th, 2018 as the date, and she's planning to hold it at the Stony Creek Hotel, where Samantha Cohen is their wedding planner.
She had a smile on her face the entire time we would meet. She just had, this look in her eye of like, this is my day, I'm so excited, let's make this happen. She wanted to be the princess for the day. Every girl imagines their wedding day and wanting to be the bride or the princess walking down the aisle.
That's what she wanted, find Prince Charming and settle down happily ever after. But I thought, what's she thinking, she don't want to marry this guy. Nothing good can come of it.
During the Christmas holidays, just a few months before the wedding is to take place, James shares some devastating news with Molly.
He tells Molly that his ex-wife Melanie has been in a terrible car accident. She's actually on life support. And he needs to be there for his children and to help them with the care of their mother.
Molly felt bad for James, told him, if he needed her to back off any, and give him some space, she would, and that she was there for him, whatever he needed, that she understood he was doing it for his kids. I think it made Molly feel guilty about the wedding coming up.
Is Melanie's supposed accident a strategy for James to get out of the wedding? Melanie, in fact, is alive and well, for now. But soon, she will come perilously close to death.
There's this really strong gas smell in our bedroom.
I believe that Melanie was at a very high risk of being killed.
To think that you're so close to losing your life, it's terrifying. It was late at night, midnight, 1 o'clock. I woke up and I smelled gas. It was very, very strong in the bedroom. I thought, well, this is not dissipating, this is not normal. And Jim wasn't there. He wasn't in our bed, he wasn't in the bathroom. So I got up and I went to find Jim to tell him that there's this really strong gas smell.
She goes downstairs and she finds that all the windows and doors are closed.
Jim wasn't anywhere in the house. And I thought, this could be serious. This particular night, he was outside on the deck, smoking a cigarette. It was unusual for him to be outside smoking. He would usually just smoke in the dining room at the window. So I told him, I said, really strong gas smell. I don't know what it is. He said, okay, well, you stay out here. And he went back in the bedroom and opened the windows and just said, I don't know, it's probably some farm equipment outside.
But it's a little suspicious because the windows are closed, and when she goes outside, she doesn't have this overpowering odor anymore.
Eventually, the smell did go away. And I was able to go back to bed, so I don't have an explanation for that. It was so strange.
While Melanie worries about James and his odd behavior, Molly Watson is blissfully anticipating her fairy tale wedding. After 7 years of dating James, her dream is finally coming true.
Her excitement was so palpable. I mean, you watch her videos and she just radiates excitement and love.
Hi everyone, it's Molly, and here is the dress on me, and I have to say I was actually really impressed.
You can tell just by talking to her, she has always dreamt of her wedding. I mean, she had 3 wedding dresses. Like, this was not just any normal day in her life. She's been dreaming of how this wedding was gonna look for years. I think she finally found, her Prince Charming, and this was the next chapter of her life.
Molly seems unaware that James lacks the same enthusiasm, but his detached demeanor is obvious to others.
When I was meeting with James and Molly, it was all Molly giving the input. He really just sat there kind of staring off into space. He was a very quiet man, didn't smile often, and just kind of was there. He didn't really give much input into the conversations, and he just didn't seem like he really wanted to be there. He didn't seem to care.
He said, oh, well, we're getting married, as long as it shuts her up, whatever. That's kind of his attitude towards it.
On April 22nd, just a week before the wedding, James drops another bombshell about his supposed ex-wife.
We were told she was in this coma, and they determined that she would never recover from her injuries. From what Molly told me directly, Melanie's life support, they were going to go ahead and pull the plug because they decided that she was too brain damaged and that they were going to have to just let her go.
I, reached out to Molly to get a final in-person meeting scheduled with her and James, and she had emailed me back saying, I don't know if James will be able to make the meeting as his ex-wife had just passed away that weekend before.
James is lying, and Melanie is still very much alive, unbeknownst to Molly and everyone else around her.
I think James wanted so badly to get out of this predicament he had created that he was hoping by creating this tragic situation and backstory that maybe Molly would come to the conclusion to cancel the wedding, and that would sort of be his get out of jail free card. But that's not what happened. He needed to keep up the charade as the loving fiance, and so he doesn't cancel the wedding because he knows that's going to devastate her.
2 days before the wedding, James still hasn't told Molly the truth.
That Friday when he came in by himself after dropped everything off and paid, I asked him, how are you feeling? And the only words that he said was that she was driving him crazy.
It's probably pretty common for grooms to be a little annoyed with brides as it gets close to the wedding. But for James, I think Molly was driving him crazy because he knew the walls were closing in. He was still married to Melanie, and he had to figure something out quickly.
The night of April 27th, Molly abruptly leaves her parents' home without much of an explanation.
She was actually making something to eat when suddenly she got a phone call. And after that phone call, Molly leaves really quickly. And she just sort of rushed out of the house. Given that she was cooking, her parents felt like she would be back really quickly.
At his home, James tells his wife Melanie he's stepping out.
No, he was out in the garage, and then he came in and said he was going to go to a friend's house. This was about 7 o'clock, and then I went to bed about 7:30. I usually go to bed pretty early.
Later that night, a driver on a deserted road notices something unusual.
He sees these two vehicles parked on the side of the road. He figures one of them is having engine trouble, so he stops to see if he can help. An older man tells him that everything's fine, he can go. And so he proceeds on his way. On his way back, he passes the same spot, only this time there's only one vehicle.
The Monroe County Sheriff's Office got a call around 10:30 at night that a passerby named Glenn McSparron had found a woman in a very remote area of Monroe County on a low water crossing. He told police that there was a woman who was laying in front of a car on this dusty, dirty country road. Her eyes were open. She did not appear alive to him.
Investigators rush to the scene.
Police quickly identify the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head. This woman is out in the middle of nowhere, and she's been shot execution style. It leads them to believe this was a planned murder, and someone lured her out there. And they identify her by finding a marriage license on her passenger seat that identifies her as Molly Watson, who's engaged to be married to James Addy.
In the early hours of April 28th, just one day before Tim Watson's sister is to be married, he gets a call from his dad.
As soon as I saw what time it was, I knew it was something serious. He said, "Timmy, the highway patrol just left our house. They found Molly dead on this dirt road." And immediately I was in shock.
About 2:30 in the morning, I got up and I looked out the window, and there were 4 vehicles with flashing lights. I went to the door, and Jim was there first. He opened the door for them, these 4 cops. So I asked them, "What's going on? Why are you here?" And nobody would answer me. Finally, somebody asked me, he said, "Who are you?" And I pointed to Jim and said, "Well, I'm his wife." And Jim said, "Yes, that's my wife." And then the mood kind of changed a little bit.
Investigators had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were making a death notification to a fiance, and they find out he's already married for 23 years. They discovered Melanie Addy, and everything changed. Suddenly, James Addy, who they expected to be the bereaved fiance who would surely receive the worst news of his entire life, was now a suspect.
Detectives escort James into the dining room for an interview, while another investigator asks Melanie curious questions.
Where were you tonight? What did you do tonight? Do you know Molly Watson? She's been found dead. I didn't know who that was. I didn't know who Molly was. I didn't know how she was at all related to my family. They told me who Molly was and that they were going to get married. I asked him, do you have the right person? Are you sure you have the right person? Because that's my husband. I was numb, I was in shock. It was hard to get this through my head because this was my husband and this was our life, and this other person had no place in it, and the story did not make sense.
Out of Melanie's earshot, James comes clean to the officers about his relationship with Molly.
He admitted the affair and said that it had been going on for 7 years.
He tells them, though, that he had absolutely nothing to do with Molly's death.
They asked him where he was that evening. James Addy responded that he left the home around 7 o'clock to go visit a friend. He said the friend was not home, so he turned around and came back home and arrived around 8:30 that evening, and that he went to bed shortly thereafter.
Did James go to bed as he claims to police, or did he secretly meet Molly? When forensics examined the bride-to-be's computer, they find evidence to suggest she had been obsessed by one thing in the 24 hours leading up to her death. And it wasn't her wedding.
Molly Watson had been searching for evidence of Melanie Addy's death. She was searching to see if there was an obituary or any evidence of this horrible accident that had eventually led to Melanie's death. Of course, Melanie Addy was very much alive, and she was unable to find any evidence that she had passed away.
Did Molly come to the crushing realization that Melanie was alive and there would be no wedding?
I think she questioned James on it, and at that point, he knew the jig was up and he had to do something.
Back at the murder scene, investigators scour the area and find Molly's cell phone and a discarded t-shirt. Police also go through Molly's phone records and are able to piece together her last known movements.
The last phone call she ever made was 22 minutes long. 22 minutes, which is the exact amount of time it took Molly Watson to drive from her home to her death. The entire time she was on the phone with James Addy.
I think somehow he convinced her to meet up with him so they could talk about it, and he got her out in the middle of nowhere and took her life.
Police looked at the victimology of Molly Watson. Who did she know? Who in her life might want her dead? And they determined that only one person, James Addy, had the motive, means, and opportunity to take Molly's life.
James Addy is arrested and taken into custody. The next day, Melanie starts looking for evidence of James's double life.
I went out to the garage, which was kind of his domain. It was a lot of storage things that we kept up there, a lot of boxes. But I started looking a little closer at the boxes, and these were not my things. These were Molly's things. They had her name on the boxes. And that's when I found the photo album of them on vacation. And a lot of kitchen stuff, just household things that were at my house. She was planning on moving in, I guess. It was very overwhelming. I didn't know how to process this. He was home every night. I don't know when he saw her or how they formed a relationship over 7 years and why he would go forward with marrying her or planning this wedding when he was still married to me. How is this supposed to work? I don't know what he was thinking. I was just angry, just angry.
Melanie thinks back to the night of the gas leak and is left to wonder about James's possible intentions. The thought is chilling.
I started to put all of that together about the gas in the bedroom. I think the idea was for me not to wake up. I think I was supposed to die. I think he was trying to get rid of one of us.
Had James tried to kill Melanie but failed, so he chose Molly instead? James Addy has been arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Molly Watson. A heartbroken Melanie confronts her husband.
I went to the jail a few days after he was arrested and asked him, what the hell? What are you doing? This is our life. And he didn't have any answers. He apologized for the affair. He never admitted that he killed her. He said that he was sorry and he didn't know we had such a perfect life. Too late now. He lost everything and he knew it. He knew everything was gone. He knew I wasn't going to stick around. I was not going to be his support system anymore. This was it. We were done.
James's case goes before the court in the spring of 2021. Prosecutors paint a picture for the jury of what they believe happened that fateful night.
The night of April 27th, I believe that he called Molly Watson and told her to get in her car and start driving to this remote area. She arrived at the low water crossing, opened the door, and he shot her once, and he panicked. He left Molly's body there for anyone to find. Going into the trial, we felt that the evidence against James Addy was overwhelming.
The T-shirt found by police is a key piece of evidence.
In addition to the T-shirt having gunshot residue on it and the victim's blood on it, there was something else important about the T-shirts. That T-shirt had been made by James Addy's daughter, Emma Addy.
And this was specific to Emma. She had made this shirt and kind of messed up the design a little bit.
She was able to identify that T-shirt as one that she had made and given to her father. So the T-shirt was extremely important because we know it came from the crime scene because it had Molly's blood on it. And we know that it came from the defendant's home.
James had told police that on the night of the murder, he'd gone out but was home by 8:30 p.m. His daughter, though, contradicts that story when faced with the daunting task of testifying against her own father.
Emma Addy was interviewed about her father's whereabouts, and she gave a very different story.
I was still up doing homework at around 10 p.m., and that's around the time that Dad came home.
He returns home and sees his daughter Emma still up. He's a little surprised, and Emma described him as being nervous. James gets in the shower right away. And Emma also notices that her dad does laundry, something that would normally be her mom's job.
And did you smell anything? Yes, I smelled bleach.
Emma Addy's testimony was key to dispute the alibi that James Addy had provided to the police. And to be able to come into court and to tell the world that your father lied to the police, it was incredible.
She had a tough job and she handled it. She did really, really well. She's an inspiration to me. She is. She's amazing.
I just plead with the jury to give this monster the max sentence possible.
On April 28th, 2021, what would have been Molly and James' third anniversary had they been married, James Addy is found guilty of Molly's murder.
I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
I just wanted justice for Molly. That's all I cared about. You know, as long as I heard those words guilty come out of the judge's mouth, and thank God they did.
He had the means, he had the motive. He didn't have a good alibi. He wasn't home that night. So it all kind of added up. He's absolutely responsible for this.
James Addy is convicted, but it's still hard to comprehend his sickening actions.
It's unfathomable that James thought the solution to the problem was to kill someone instead of just breaking up with them. In his mind, that was the right thing to do, and that's what's scary. It's terrifying that that is his way out.
Had he have walked away, just never talked to her again, we'd be fine with that. You know, she'd be upset. She'd still be here. He chose to take her life. He's an evil person.
It's tragic to think that somebody who was so excited to be a bride and to have a happily ever after instead had this tragic ending.
The family, they're the ones that suffer in this. They are the true victims. They've lost Molly, and they will lose her, you know, at family get-togethers and holidays and vacations, and she's just not there for them.
She definitely knows how much I love her. I would like Molly to be remembered as the sweet, loving, giving person she was. She'd do anything for anybody.
I'd hug her and just say how sorry I am that this happened to her. And I hope she feels that justice has been served. And I hope she's okay.
I still go out to her gravesite and I have conversations with her, you know, and she said everything's fine, everything's okay.
As for Melanie, she has found a semblance of...
The first thing they noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind, the kind that settles over a Florida highway just before sunrise, when the air hangs thick with humidity and the asphalt still radiates yesterday's heat. This silence felt wrong. Heavy. Like something had been pressed into the earth and forgotten, but not completely. The car sat at an awkward angle off the side of the road, half hidden by scrub and palmetto. Its metallic surface caught the early morning light in dull flashes, like a signal no one had answered. The door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, not closed. Just enough to suggest interruption. A highway patrol officer slowed his cruiser as he passed. For a moment, he almost kept driving. Abandoned vehicles weren't rare in this part of Florida. People ran out of gas, broke down, walked off to find help. It happened. But something tugged at him, an instinct honed over years of quiet roads and bad outcomes. He pulled over. The air outside was already thick, pressing against his uniform as he stepped out. Insects buzzed lazily in the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a truck roared past, its sound fading quickly, swallowed by the flat expanse of land. He approached the car carefully, one hand resting near his holster. The closer he got, the more details began to surface. The tires weren't flat. No obvious signs of collision. The interior disordered. Not chaotic, but disturbed, like someone had searched through it in a hurry or left in one. He leaned slightly, peering inside. Keys still in the ignition. Wallet gone. No driver. And then he saw it. A dark stain on the seat, soaked deep into the fabric. Old enough to have dried, but still unmistakable. Blood. That moment, quiet, almost insignificant in the grand scale of things, would become the first thread in a story that stretched far beyond that roadside. A story that would unravel across highways, motels, and forgotten corners of America. A story that would challenge the line between predator and victim, truth and survival. Because somewhere out there, moving through the same humid air, was a woman who did not see herself as a killer. She saw herself as someone who had done what she had to do. Her name was Aileen Wuornos. Long before her name would fill headlines, long before courtrooms and cameras and debates over guilt and innocence, she was just another figure on the edge of the road. Someone drivers might pass without a second glance. A silhouette against the glow of headlights. A raised thumb. A silent question. And sometimes, someone stopped. The men who stopped didn't know they were stepping into something irreversible. Maybe they thought they were in control. Maybe they believed the exchange was simple, transactional. A moment of desire, a brief escape, a story they'd never tell. But the road has a way of stripping things down to their rawest form. Out there, beyond city lights and crowded streets, there are fewer witnesses. Fewer interruptions. Just long stretches of darkness and the quiet hum of tires against asphalt. It's the kind of place where trust becomes a gamble. and where the outcome can turn in an instant. In the months that followed that first discovery, more bodies would emerge. Not all at once. Not in a pattern obvious enough to alarm immediately. Each one found in isolation, separated by miles and time, as if the land itself was reluctantly giving up its secrets. A hunter stumbled across one in the woods, drawn by a scent that didn't belong. Another was found by chance, partially concealed, the Florida sun already beginning its work. Each scene carried echoes of the same violence. The same finality. Gunshots. Close range. No hesitation. The victims were men. Ordinary on the surface. Different ages, different backgrounds, different lives that had intersected, briefly, with someone they did not truly know. Investigators began to connect the dots, slowly at first, then with growing certainty. A pattern was forming. A presence moving along the highways. Someone who blended into the margins, who operated in the spaces most people overlooked. And yet, even as suspicion grew, the question lingered. Why? Because this wasn't the story people expected. Serial killers, as the public imagined them, followed certain scripts. There were familiar archetypes, patterns of behavior that had been studied, categorized, almost predicted. But this felt different. The idea of a woman committing a series of murders in this way disrupted those expectations. It didn't fit neatly into the frameworks investigators were used to applying. And when something doesn't fit, it becomes harder to see clearly. Was this calculated? Opportunistic? Driven by something deeper, something fractured long before any of these men crossed her path? Or was it, as she would later insist, something else entirely? Self-defense. The word would echo through interviews, interrogations, courtrooms. It would be repeated, dissected, challenged. It would divide opinions and ignite debates that would persist long after the case itself had been closed. Because if even part of that claim were true, it forced a different kind of reckoning. It meant looking beyond the crimes themselves and into the life that led up to them. Into the years of instability, violence, and survival that shaped the person at the center of it all. But in those early days, standing beside abandoned cars and scattered remains, investigators weren't thinking about philosophy or psychology. They were thinking about stopping whoever was responsible. Time stretched in strange ways during investigations like this. Days blurred together, punctuated by moments of sudden clarity or crushing frustration. Leads that seemed promising would dissolve. Witnesses remembered fragments, half-formed details that hinted at something just out of reach. A woman. Blonde, sometimes described as rough-looking, other times forgettable. A drifter. A hitchhiker. A sex worker. Different words, same outline. She moved along the highways, appearing and disappearing, leaving behind questions and, eventually, bodies. And all the while, the road kept moving. Cars passed. People traveled. Life continued, unaware or unwilling to look too closely at what was unfolding just beyond the shoulder. There's something unsettling about crimes that happen in these in-between spaces. They don't belong to a single neighborhood or community. They slip through the cracks, scattered across jurisdictions, diluted by distance. It makes them harder to grasp. Harder to contain. And for a while, that's exactly what this was. Uncontained. Until it wasn't. Because every story like this reaches a point where the threads tighten, where the randomness gives way to recognition. Where a name begins to form, attached to the acts that once seemed disconnected. But before that moment, before the arrest, before the trial, before the world would come to know who she was, there was just the road. Endless. Unforgiving. Silent in a way that felt almost complicit. And somewhere along that road, a woman kept moving forward, carrying with her a version of the truth that no one had fully heard yet. A version that would clash, violently, with everything the evidence seemed to say. The silence at that first scene wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the beginning of something waiting to be understood. Or misunderstood. Because in the story of Aileen Wuornos, the line between monster and survivor was never as clear as it seemed. And once you step into that uncertainty, it's hard to find your way back out. Before the headlines, before the courtroom sketches and the cold language of legal documents, there was a small town shaped by long winters and quiet resignation. Michigan in the late 1950s was a place where people worked hard, kept their struggles private, and believed, sometimes stubbornly, that hardship was something you endured, not something you spoke about. It was into that world, in 1956, that Aileen Wuornos was born, a child who would grow up surrounded not by stability, but by absence. Her father was gone before she could form a memory of him, a shadow more than a presence. He would later be known for violence of his own, a man whose life ended behind prison walls, leaving behind a legacy that felt less like inheritance and more like a warning. Her mother, young and overwhelmed, did not stay long either. One day, she was simply no longer there, leaving Aileen and her brother in the care of their grandparents. There was no ceremony to it, no gentle explanation, just a quiet rearrangement of responsibility that would define the shape of Aileen's early years. The house she grew up in did not feel like a refuge. It was a place where affection was scarce and discipline came quickly, sometimes harshly. The adults who raised her were not equipped, or perhaps not willing, to provide the kind of care that builds trust in a child. Instead, there were raised voices, sharp words, and moments that lingered long after they ended. The kind of moments that teach a child to stay alert, to read expressions, to anticipate danger before it fully arrives. Outside, the world offered little escape. School was not a sanctuary. Other children noticed the differences, the worn clothes, the lack of supervision, the quiet volatility that clung to her. Isolation settled in early, wrapping itself around her interactions, making connection feel like something reserved for other people. She learned quickly that vulnerability came with a cost. As she grew older, the instability deepened. There were rumors, whispers about what happened behind closed doors, about lines crossed that should never have been approached. Whether every detail was known or understood at the time didn't matter as much as the impact it left behind. Trust, already fragile, fractured further. The world became a place where safety was conditional, fleeting, and often illusory. By the time she reached her early teens, the trajectory was already shifting away from anything resembling a conventional path. Home was no longer a place she could or would remain. The departure wasn't dramatic. There was no single defining moment, no final argument that pushed her out the door. It was more like a slow erosion, a realization that staying meant continuing a cycle she could not control. So she left. The road did not welcome her, but it did not reject her either. It simply existed, stretching endlessly, offering movement without direction. For someone with nowhere else to go, that was enough. Life on the margins required adaptation. There were no safety nets, no guarantees. Survival became a daily calculation, a series of choices made under pressure. Food, shelter, protection, each one had to be negotiated, often at a cost. It was during this time that Aileen began exchanging her body for money, a transaction that reduced human connection to something immediate and transactional. It was not framed as a decision in the way most people understand decisions. It was necessity, stripped of illusion. The men she encountered during those years were not a single, uniform group. Some were indifferent, treating her as an object and nothing more. Others were unpredictable, their intentions shifting without warning. There were moments that reinforced her belief that danger was always just beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself. Each encounter added another layer to her understanding of the world, shaping how she moved through it, how she interpreted threat, how she responded when she felt cornered. Florida would eventually become her primary landscape, a stark contrast to the cold austerity of Michigan. Florida offered warmth, open roads, and a transient population that made it easier to blend in. Highways cut through stretches of land that felt both exposed and hidden at the same time. Motels flickered with neon signs, promising anonymity for a price. Gas stations became informal meeting points, places where drivers slowed down, where brief exchanges could turn into something more. This environment was not unique to Aileen, but it was one she navigated with increasing familiarity. She learned where to stand, how to signal, how to read the subtle cues that hinted at what a driver might want or might do. The road became a kind of ecosystem, with its own rules, its own rhythms. It was a place where identities were fluid, where names could be changed, where pasts could be left unspoken. And yet, even within that fluidity, patterns emerged. There were nights when the air felt heavier, when something in a driver's tone or posture suggested a shift from transaction to potential threat. There were moments when instinct took over, when decisions were made quickly, without the luxury of reflection. Those moments mattered. They accumulated, shaping not just her actions, but her perception of every interaction that followed. By the late 1980s, Aileen was no longer just surviving, she was entrenched in a way of life that left little room for alternatives. The boundaries between risk and routine had blurred. Carrying a weapon was not an abstract idea, it was a practical consideration. The road had taught her that control was something you either maintained or lost, often in an instant. At the same time, there were glimpses of something else, fragments of a life that might have been different under other circumstances. Relationships, however unstable, suggested a desire for connection that had never fully disappeared. There were moments of laughter, of shared experience, of temporary escape from the constant tension that defined her daily existence. But those moments were fragile, easily disrupted by the realities that surrounded them. The broader world, meanwhile, moved on largely unaware. The late 1980s in America were marked by change, by economic shifts and cultural movements that felt distant from the quiet, isolated stretches of highway where Aileen spent much of her time. News cycles focused on other stories, other concerns. The lives unfolding at the edges rarely made it into the center of public attention. This disconnect mattered. It created space for patterns to develop without immediate recognition, space for actions to go unnoticed until they reached a certain threshold. In environments where people come and go, where identities are transient, it becomes easier for events to remain unconnected, for stories to exist in isolation. For Aileen, this meant that the world she inhabited operated under a different set of assumptions. Encounters were brief, often anonymous. Consequences, when they came, were not always immediate or visible. It was a landscape that both concealed and revealed, depending on where you stood. Understanding that setting is crucial, not as an excuse, but as context. Because the actions that would later define her cannot be separated from the environment in which they occurred. The highways of Florida were not just backdrops, they were active elements in the story, shaping how events unfolded, how people met, how violence could occur without immediate interruption. There is a tendency, when looking back at cases like this, to search for clear turning points, moments where everything shifted irreversibly. But in reality, the transition is often gradual. It happens in increments, each step building on the last, until the distance traveled is only visible in hindsight. By the time the first known victim crossed paths with Aileen Wuornos, the foundation had already been laid. Years of instability, exposure to violence, and the constant pressure of survival had created a framework through which she interpreted the world. Whether that framework justified her actions is a question that would later divide opinions sharply. But it undeniably influenced how those actions came to be. The roads of Florida did not change overnight. They remained what they had always been: long, open, indifferent. Cars continued to pass. Drivers continued to make choices, to stop or keep going, to engage or ignore. Most of those choices led to nothing more than brief, forgettable interactions. But some did not. And in those moments, when two lives intersected under the dim glow of headlights and the vast, watching sky, the setting became more than just a backdrop. It became a stage where tension, fear, and power played out in ways that would leave lasting consequences. The story that began to unfold in that environment was not just about one person or one series of events. It was about the collision of circumstances, of personal history and external conditions, of perception and reality. It was about how a life shaped by instability could intersect with others in ways that defied simple explanation. As the investigation would later reveal, the highways held more than just movement. They held traces, fragments of encounters that, when pieced together, would form a narrative far more complex than it first appeared. But at this stage, none of that was visible. There was only the setting, the heat, the roads, the quiet spaces in between. And a woman moving through them, carrying with her a past that refused to stay buried, shaping every step she took into a future that was already beginning to take form. They did not know each other. That is one of the most unsettling truths at the center of this story. The lives that would eventually collide along the highways of Florida were not bound by shared history, long-standing conflict, or even coincidence in the traditional sense. They were strangers, connected only by a brief decision, one that, in another version of events, might have ended with nothing more than a forgotten night. But behind each of those encounters was a life already in motion, already shaped by its own routines, relationships, and quiet expectations. The men who would later be reduced to names in case files were not defined by the moment they died. They had existed long before that, moving through ordinary days, carrying plans that extended into futures they assumed would arrive. One of them woke early most mornings, the kind of person who preferred the stillness before the world fully stirred. He would step outside with a cup of coffee, letting the humid air settle around him, listening to the distant hum of traffic that never quite disappeared in this part of the state. There was comfort in routine, in knowing how the day would likely unfold. Work, errands, small conversations that filled the space between larger events. Nothing extraordinary, but steady. Another spent long hours on the road as part of his job, driving between cities, watching the landscape shift from urban clusters to stretches of open land and back again. The road, for him, was not a place of danger but of familiarity. He knew the exits, the gas stations, the rhythm of traffic at different times of day. It was a world he understood, one that made sense in a way that other parts of life sometimes did not. There were others, each with their own version of normalcy. Some had families who expected them home at certain hours, who noticed when routines were broken. Others lived more solitary lives, where absence could stretch longer before it raised concern. But all of them shared a basic assumption that the world, while imperfect, operated within boundaries that made it navigable. That assumption would be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. It is easy, in retrospect, to compress these lives into a single category: victims. The word is accurate, but it is also incomplete. It flattens complexity, reduces individuality to a role within a larger narrative. To understand the weight of what happened, it is necessary to look beyond that label, to consider who these men were before they became part of this case. There were habits, preferences, small details that defined them. The way one of them always kept his car meticulously clean, as if order in that space could extend into other parts of his life. The way another had a tendency to strike up conversations with strangers, not out of suspicion but out of a genuine curiosity about people. These are the kinds of traits that rarely make it into official reports, but they matter. They remind us that these were not abstract figures, they were individuals with histories that did not begin or end on the side of a highway. Their paths crossed with Aileen Wuornos in moments that, at first glance, might have seemed ordinary within the context of that environment. A car slows. A window rolls down. A brief exchange, words that establish intent, negotiate terms, create a temporary connection between two people who will likely never see each other again. In most cases, that is where the story would end. But these encounters unfolded differently. What exactly happened in those moments has been the subject of intense scrutiny, conflicting accounts, and enduring debate. There were no witnesses to provide a clear, consistent narrative. The only perspectives available came from physical evidence and, later, from Aileen herself, accounts that would shift, sometimes subtly, sometimes significantly, as time went on. She would claim that the men she killed had threatened her, that they had attempted to assault her, that she acted in self-defense. It is a claim that forces a reconsideration of the dynamics at play in those isolated spaces. Because the reality of life on the margins, particularly for someone in her position, does include genuine risk. Violence is not hypothetical, it is a known possibility. At the same time, investigators would point to patterns that suggested something more deliberate. The use of a firearm, the theft of personal belongings, the consistency across multiple incidents, these elements painted a picture that did not align neatly with spontaneous acts of self-defense. Instead, they suggested a level of control, of repetition, that raised difficult questions about intent. For the men involved, those questions would never be answered from their perspective. Their stories ended abruptly, leaving behind fragments for others to interpret. One of the earliest victims was found in a wooded area, his body partially concealed by the natural landscape. The discovery was accidental, the result of someone moving through the area for entirely unrelated reasons. There was no immediate connection to anything larger, no indication that this was part of a series. It was treated as an isolated incident, tragic but contained. Then another body was found, and then another. Each discovery added weight to the growing sense that these were not random occurrences. There were similarities that could not be ignored, details that linked the cases even as they were separated by distance and time. The victims, all men, all connected in some way to the same transient world of highways and roadside encounters. Their families began to feel the absence in ways that were both immediate and lingering. A missed phone call that turned into a day of silence, then two. A routine that was broken without explanation. The gradual shift from concern to fear, as possibilities narrowed and hope became more fragile. For those who knew them best, the public narrative that would later emerge was only a partial reflection of who they had been. Media coverage tends to focus on the most relevant details to the case, the aspects that fit within the framework of the story being told. But behind those details were relationships that extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Conversations left unfinished. Plans that would never be realized. The quiet, often overlooked moments that make up a life, shared meals, inside jokes, the comfort of familiarity. These are the things that do not appear in investigative files, but they are what make the loss tangible. As the number of victims increased, so did the urgency of the investigation. Law enforcement agencies began to coordinate more closely, sharing information, looking for connections that could lead to an identification of the person responsible. The pattern was becoming clearer, but the identity behind it remained just out of reach. In the absence of a suspect, speculation filled the gaps. Who could be responsible for a series of killings like this? What kind of person moves through the world in this way, leaving behind such consistent violence? The answer, when it began to take shape, would challenge assumptions. Because the image that many people held of a serial killer did not align with the reality that investigators were uncovering. The idea that a woman, someone who, in many contexts, might be perceived as vulnerable rather than threatening, could be at the center of this series of murders forced a shift in perspective. For the victims, that distinction came too late. Their stories, once separate, had become intertwined through a series of events that none of them had anticipated. The roads they traveled, the decisions they made in moments that felt ordinary, had converged in a way that would ultimately define how they were remembered. And yet, to reduce them solely to that convergence is to miss the broader truth. They were not just victims of a crime. They were individuals whose lives intersected, briefly and fatally, with someone whose own story was shaped by forces that extended far beyond those final encounters. Understanding that intersection does not diminish the harm that was done. It does not resolve the questions that remain. But it does add depth to a narrative that might otherwise be seen only in stark, binary terms. Because in the end, this is not just a story about what happened on those highways. It is a story about the people who were there, on both sides of those encounters, each carrying their own history into a moment that would change everything. And for the men who never returned from those roads, that moment became the final chapter in lives that had once seemed, in all their ordinary complexity, destined to continue. The night air along the highways of Florida has a way of clinging to the skin, heavy and damp, carrying with it the faint smell of asphalt, gasoline, and distant marshland. Headlights carve brief tunnels through the darkness, illuminating fragments of a world that disappears as quickly as it appears. It is a place of motion, of passing through, where most encounters are fleeting and forgettable. But not all of them. On a stretch of road that seemed no different from countless others, a car slowed. The driver's decision was almost instinctive, shaped by habit, curiosity, or something less easily defined. Ahead, a figure stood near the shoulder, partially lit by the glow of approaching headlights. A woman, alone, her posture suggesting both vulnerability and intent. A raised arm, a signal that could mean many things depending on who was interpreting it. The car pulled over. What followed, at least in the beginning, likely resembled a pattern that had played out many times before. A brief exchange through the open window. Words negotiated quickly, efficiently, as if both parties understood the unspoken rules. The woman entered the vehicle, the door closing with a muted thud that seemed to seal the space around them. Inside, the world narrowed. The outside darkness pressed against the windows, turning the interior into something almost isolated, detached from the rest of the road. The driver resumed motion, tires humming against the pavement, the rhythm steady, predictable. For a time, there may have been conversation. Small talk, perhaps, or silence broken only by the sound of the engine. It is impossible to know exactly what was said, what expressions passed between them, what subtle shifts in tone or posture may have signaled the direction things were about to take. At some point, the dynamic changed. This is where the narratives begin to diverge, where certainty gives way to interpretation. According to Aileen Wuornos, the shift was abrupt and unmistakable. She would later describe moments where the men she encountered became threatening, where the balance of control tipped dangerously, where she felt cornered in a way that triggered something immediate and visceral. In her version, the car is no longer just a vehicle but a confined space, the air thick with tension. A hand moves in a way that feels wrong. A tone hardens. The implicit agreement that defined the encounter begins to fracture, replaced by something more unpredictable, more dangerous. Fear, in those moments, is not abstract. It is physical. It tightens the chest, sharpens the senses, narrows the field of focus to immediate survival. Decisions are made quickly, often without the kind of reflection that comes later. There is no time for careful consideration, only reaction. A weapon appears. The sound of a gunshot inside a confined space is deafening, a violent rupture that seems to consume everything around it. It is not a clean, cinematic moment. It is chaotic, disorienting. The smell of gunpowder mixes with the already heavy air, creating something acrid, unforgettable. In the aftermath, there is a brief, suspended silence. The kind that follows sudden violence, where the reality of what has just occurred has not yet fully settled. The car may still be moving, or it may have veered off, coming to an uneven stop somewhere along the roadside or deeper into a less visible area. In that silence, the roles have shifted completely. The man who moments before was in control of the vehicle, of the situation, now lies motionless, his presence reduced to stillness. The woman, breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through her, is left to process what has just happened in a matter of seconds. This is the version she would present, again and again, each time with variations that both reinforced and complicated the narrative. It is a version that centers on immediate threat, on the necessity of action, on the idea that there was no alternative. But the physical evidence, when examined later, would introduce elements that suggested a different sequence of events. Multiple gunshots in some cases. Wounds that indicated not just a single, reactive discharge, but repeated firing. The positioning of bodies, the locations where they were found, often away from the main road, in areas that required deliberate movement to reach. These details hinted at actions that extended beyond a single moment of panic. In one instance, a man's body was discovered in a wooded area, his vehicle found separately, abandoned but intact. The distance between the two suggested that after the initial act of violence, there had been time to make decisions, to move, to conceal. That time is difficult to reconcile with a purely reactive scenario. And yet, to dismiss her claims entirely is to ignore the context in which these encounters occurred. The reality of her life, the environment she operated in, the risks inherent in those roadside exchanges, these factors cannot be separated from the events themselves. What happened inside those vehicles, in those moments when the outside world fell away, exists in a space where clarity is hard to achieve. There are no witnesses, no recordings, only the aftermath and the conflicting interpretations of how it came to be. What is clear is the pattern that emerged. The encounters followed a similar structure. A meeting along the highway. A transition into a more isolated space. The use of a firearm. The subsequent disappearance of the victim's personal belongings, cars, money, items that could be sold or used. After each incident, the road reclaimed its quiet. The car would be left somewhere, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes partially concealed. The body, in many cases, was moved away from immediate view, placed in areas where discovery would not be immediate. Days, sometimes longer, would pass before someone stumbled upon what had been left behind. In those intervening hours, life continued around the absence. People drove past abandoned vehicles without knowing what they contained. Families waited for calls that did not come. The connection between these isolated events remained just out of reach, each one a fragment of a larger picture that had not yet fully formed. For Aileen, the period after each incident was not marked by stillness. It was movement, continuation. The same highways, the same routines, the same need to survive. The acts themselves, however they were justified or rationalized, became part of a cycle. There is a moment, in any series of repeated actions, where the boundary between exception and pattern begins to blur. The first time may feel singular, defined by specific circumstances. The second introduces the possibility of repetition. By the third, the pattern is no longer theoretical. By the time the number reached 7, the pattern was undeniable. Each incident added weight, not just in terms of evidence, but in the psychological landscape surrounding the case. For investigators, it signaled a level of consistency that demanded a focused response. For the public, once the details began to emerge, it challenged deeply held assumptions about who commits this kind of violence and why. But within the moments themselves, the confined spaces of cars pulled off dark roads, the seconds where tension escalated into something irreversible, those broader implications were absent. There was only the immediate. The shift in tone. The perception of threat. The decision to act. And the consequences that followed. In reconstructing these events, there is an inherent tension between understanding and judgment. To understand is not to excuse, but it does require a willingness to consider multiple perspectives, to acknowledge uncertainty where it exists. What cannot be disputed is the outcome. 7 men lost their lives in encounters that began with something as simple as a car slowing down on a darkened road. 7 moments where the ordinary gave way to the irreversible. The highways of Florida, unchanged in their physical form, carried the weight of those events in ways that were not immediately visible. Each passing car, each brief interaction, existed within a space that had already been marked by violence, even if those moving through it were unaware. And somewhere along those roads, between the stretches of light and shadow, the story continued to unfold, each new encounter adding another layer to a narrative that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The incidents themselves, isolated yet connected, formed the core of what would later be examined, debated, and dissected in courtrooms and beyond. But in the moment, there was no audience. Only the road. The car. 2 people. And a decision that, once made, could not be undone. The land did not give up its secrets easily. In the dense undergrowth and flat expanses of Florida, things could remain hidden longer than people expected. The heat accelerated decay, the wildlife disturbed what was left behind, and the vastness of certain areas created natural barriers against accidental discovery. It was a landscape that absorbed disruption and, for a time, made it look like nothing had happened at all. Until something shifted. A hunter moving through a wooded area first noticed it as a break in the natural pattern. Not a clear sign, not something immediately identifiable, just a subtle disruption in the way the ground and foliage settled. The kind of detail that most people would overlook, but one that stood out to someone accustomed to reading the environment. He moved closer, cautious but curious. The smell reached him before the sight fully formed. It was faint at first, carried unevenly through the humid air, but unmistakable once recognized. Decay has a presence that is difficult to ignore, a biological certainty that signals something has gone wrong. What he found was not a scene arranged for discovery. There was no attempt at dramatic concealment, no elaborate effort to erase all traces. The body lay partially exposed, the surrounding area disturbed in a way that suggested movement, not permanence. Leaves and debris had settled unevenly, as if placed quickly, without precision. The position of the body told its own fragmented story. Limbs not aligned naturally, clothing disordered, the stillness too complete. It was clear that whatever had happened did not occur in that exact spot. The site was not the origin of the violence, but a destination chosen afterward. Law enforcement arrived with the measured urgency that accompanies uncertain situations. The initial approach was cautious, procedural. Scenes like this demanded control, attention to detail, and an understanding that every element, no matter how small, could matter later. The air felt heavier as they worked, the combination of heat and the reality of the situation creating a kind of pressure that was both physical and psychological. Investigators moved deliberately, marking positions, noting distances, documenting everything before it could be altered by time or interference. The body bore the most immediate evidence. Gunshot wounds, close range. The entry points were clear enough to establish the cause of death, even before a full autopsy could confirm it. There was no weapon present, no immediate indication of a struggle in that specific location. This reinforced the initial impression: the killing had occurred elsewhere. Pockets were empty. Wallet missing. Identification, if it had been carried, was gone. This absence created a delay in understanding who the victim was, turning the case, at least temporarily, into a question without a name. It is a particular kind of challenge for investigators, one that slows the process and introduces additional layers of uncertainty. Without identity, there is no immediate timeline, no known last movements, no direct connections to follow. The body was transported, the scene secured as best as possible, but even in those early stages, there was a sense, subtle, not yet fully articulated, that this might not be an isolated incident. That sense deepened with the next discovery. Days later, in a different location, another body was found. The circumstances were similar enough to draw attention, though not yet definitive. Again, the setting was removed from public view, an area where chance played a significant role in the timing of discovery. Again, the signs pointed to a shooting, the wounds consistent with a firearm used at relatively close range. And again, there were missing items. A pattern was beginning to take shape, but it was still incomplete, like a series of dots not yet connected into a clear image. In parallel, reports of abandoned vehicles started to surface. Cars left along roadsides, in parking lots, in places where they did not belong. Some were discovered quickly, their presence obvious and disruptive. Others sat longer, blending into the background of a landscape where vehicles come and go with regularity. When these cars were examined, they revealed details that began to bridge the gap between separate incidents. Keys left behind. Personal effects missing. In some cases, traces that suggested something violent had occurred inside, subtle signs at first, a stain here, a mark there, easily overlooked without closer inspection. But once investigators knew what to look for, those details became more significant. The interiors of these vehicles were contained environments, spaces where evidence could linger even after attempts to remove it. Fibers, residues, the faint imprint of actions that had taken place in confined quarters. Each car became its own microscene, holding fragments of a larger narrative. As forensic teams worked through these findings, connections began to solidify. The victims, once identified, shared certain characteristics. Adult men, different backgrounds but linked by the circumstances of their final known movements. Several had last been seen in areas associated with transient activity, gas stations, bars, roadside stops, places where brief, anonymous interactions were common. Witness statements added another layer, though they were often incomplete or uncertain. A woman seen near one of the locations. Blonde hair, sometimes described as unkempt, other times simply forgettable. A presence that did not stand out enough to be remembered clearly, but not so ordinary as to be entirely invisible. These accounts were not enough to form a definitive profile, but they introduced a consistent element into the investigation. A figure moving through different locations, appearing at the edges of multiple incidents. Still, the picture remained fragmented. Each new discovery brought additional information, but also new questions. The time between incidents varied, creating gaps that were difficult to interpret. The locations, while all within the same general region, were spread out enough to complicate jurisdictional coordination. Different law enforcement agencies became involved, each with their own procedures, their own priorities. Information had to be shared, compared, aligned. In cases like this, the challenge is not just solving the crime, but ensuring that all relevant pieces are brought together in a way that allows for a coherent understanding. Communication became critical. Details that might have seemed insignificant in isolation gained importance when viewed alongside similar findings from other scenes. The absence of identification, the consistent use of a firearm, the removal of personal belongings, these elements began to form a pattern that could not be ignored. The term serial began to surface in discussions, cautiously at first. It is not a label applied lightly. It carries implications that extend beyond individual cases, suggesting a continuity of behavior, a repetition that transforms isolated incidents into a broader phenomenon. For investigators, acknowledging that possibility shifts the entire approach. Resources are reallocated. Strategies are adjusted. The focus moves from solving a single crime to identifying and stopping an individual who may continue to act. As this shift occurred, the urgency intensified. Each undiscovered scene, each missing person report, carried the potential to be connected. Time became a more pressing factor, not just in preserving evidence, but in preventing further harm. Meanwhile, the physical evidence continued to accumulate. Ballistics analysis indicated similarities between the bullets recovered from different victims, suggesting the use of the same or similar firearm. This was a crucial development, providing a tangible link between cases that had previously been connected primarily through circumstantial factors. It narrowed the possibilities, pointing toward a single perpetrator rather than multiple, unrelated incidents. Yet even with this progress, the identity behind that weapon remained unknown. The investigation existed in a space between clarity and uncertainty, where enough was understood to recognize the pattern, but not enough to fully define the person responsible. For the families of the victims, the discoveries were both answers and new sources of pain. Confirmation of death replaced the ambiguity of absence, but it also introduced the reality of how those deaths had occurred. Details filtered through official channels, sometimes reaching them in fragments, sometimes all at once. Each piece added to the weight of loss, transforming personal grief into part of a larger, more public narrative. The scenes themselves, once processed, returned to stillness. Markers removed. Tape taken down. The land, in its indifferent way, began to reclaim what had been temporarily exposed. But the impact remained, carried forward in reports, in evidence lockers, in the minds of those working the case. What had started as isolated discoveries was now understood as something interconnected, a series of events linked by method, circumstance, and an emerging profile that pointed toward a single, elusive figure. The question was no longer whether these cases were related. It was who was responsible, and where they would strike next. By the time investigators began to accept that they were not dealing with isolated incidents, the case had already developed a kind of quiet momentum, one that moved forward unevenly, shaped as much by uncertainty as by evidence. Across multiple jurisdictions in Florida, files thickened, timelines stretched, and names, both of victims and potential suspects, began to accumulate without forming a clear center. This was the phase of the investigation where everything felt possible and nothing felt certain. Leads came in from different directions, some seemingly promising, others unraveling almost as soon as they were examined. Each abandoned car, each recovered body, each witness statement added a piece to the puzzle, but the pieces did not yet fit together in a way that revealed the full picture. The profile, as it began to take shape, was both specific and frustratingly vague. The victims were men, all connected in some way to the transient ecosystem of highways, truck stops, and roadside encounters. The method was consistent: gunshots, often at close range, followed by the removal of personal belongings and the abandonment of vehicles. This suggested a perpetrator who was mobile, adaptable, and familiar with the geography of the area. Someone who understood how to move without drawing attention, how to operate in spaces where anonymity was not unusual but expected. But who? At first, investigators looked in directions that aligned with more traditional expectations. The possibility of a male suspect dominated early discussions. It was, statistically and historically, the more common scenario. Serial offenses of this nature, involving multiple victims across different locations, often pointed toward a certain type of offender, someone who fit into established behavioral patterns. So they searched for him. They looked into known offenders in the region, individuals with histories of violent crime or robbery. They reviewed records, cross-referenced timelines, examined alibis. Some names surfaced repeatedly, attached to past incidents that bore superficial similarities to the current case. One suspect, a drifter with a record of assault and theft, seemed to fit certain aspects of the profile. He had been seen in areas near where one of the victims' vehicles was found. His movements were difficult to track, his explanations inconsistent. For a brief period, attention focused heavily on him. Interviews were conducted. His background was dissected. Every detail of his recent activity was scrutinized. But as the evidence was examined more closely, the connections began to weaken. Timelines did not align as cleanly as initially thought. Physical evidence failed to place him definitively at any of the crime scenes. What had seemed like a promising lead gradually dissolved into another dead end. And he was not the only one. Several individuals came under suspicion at different points in the investigation. Some were reported by acquaintances who noticed changes in behavior, unusual statements, or unexplained absences. Others emerged through routine checks, their names flagged due to proximity or past criminal activity. Each lead required time and resources. Each had to be followed far enough to determine whether it held any real connection to the case. And more often than not, they led nowhere. This is the reality of investigations at this stage, a constant balancing act between pursuing possibilities and recognizing when to let them go. The risk of overlooking something important is always present, but so is the danger of becoming too focused on a single theory that does not ultimately hold up. Meanwhile, the witness accounts continued to circulate. A woman. That detail, initially treated as peripheral, began to appear with enough frequency to demand attention. Different witnesses, in different locations, described someone who matched a similar general appearance. A blonde woman, sometimes described as rough-looking, sometimes as simply out of place. Someone seen near the victim's last known locations, someone who had been picked up or spoken to briefly. At first, these accounts were difficult to reconcile with the prevailing assumptions. The idea of a female perpetrator in a case like this challenged established patterns, and that made it harder to integrate into the working theory. But the consistency could not be ignored. Investigators began to revisit earlier reports, looking for instances where a female presence had been mentioned but not fully explored. They re-examined timelines, considering how a woman operating in that environment might move, how she might interact with potential victims, how she might avoid suspicion. This shift did not immediately clarify the case, but it did open new avenues of inquiry. Attention turned toward individuals who fit that emerging description: women living on the margins, moving through the same transient spaces as the victims. Sex workers, hitchhikers, drifters, people whose lives intersected with the highways in ways that were often invisible to the broader public. It was a wide net, and not an easy one to manage. The nature of that population meant that records were incomplete, identities fluid, movements difficult to track. People came and went, sometimes using different names, sometimes leaving no formal trace at all. Finding a specific individual within that context was like trying to follow a single thread through a constantly shifting fabric. Still, investigators persisted. They conducted interviews in places that rarely saw law enforcement attention unless something had already gone wrong. Motels with flickering signs, bars where conversations blurred together, roadside stops where people paused briefly before moving on. In these environments, information was often fragmented, passed along in pieces that had to be assembled carefully. Some remembered seeing a woman who fit the description. Others recalled brief interactions, moments that had not seemed significant at the time but now took on new meaning. A conversation overheard, a ride given, a name maybe real, maybe not mentioned in passing. But memory is unreliable, especially when filtered through time and uncertainty. Descriptions varied. Details conflicted. What seemed clear in one account became ambiguous in another. And so the investigation moved forward in increments, each small development offset by new questions. At the same time, forensic analysis continued to play a crucial role. Ballistics reports reinforced the connection between the cases, indicating that the same weapon, or at least the same type of weapon, had been used in multiple incidents. This provided a solid foundation, a point of certainty in an otherwise shifting landscape. But a weapon, on its own, does not identify a person. It narrows the field, but it does not close it. The absence of the firearm itself was a significant obstacle. Without it, there was no direct link to a specific individual, no opportunity to trace ownership or history. It existed only through the evidence it left behind, a silent participant in each crime. As weeks turned into months, the pressure mounted. Media coverage began to pick up, bringing the case into the public eye. The idea of a serial offender operating along the highways of Florida captured attention, creating both awareness and anxiety. Tips increased in volume, but not necessarily in quality. For every potentially useful piece of information, there were dozens that led nowhere. Investigators had to sift through it all, separating what might matter from what clearly did not. It was during this period that the case felt most uncertain. The pattern was clear. The urgency was undeniable. But the person at the center of it all remained just out of reach. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes with knowing you are close to understanding something without being able to fully grasp it. The outline is there, the shape visible in fragments, but the defining details are missing. That was where the investigation stood. Close enough to recognize the contours of the truth, but not yet able to bring it into focus. And somewhere beyond that incomplete picture, moving through the same network of roads and encounters, was the person they were trying to find, continuing a pattern that, for the moment, remained unbroken. The dead ends, the false leads, the shifting theories, all of it was part of the process. But time was not on their side. Because as long as the identity behind those crimes remained unknown, the possibility of another incident was not just theoretical. It was expected. The break did not arrive as a sudden revelation, not at first. It came quietly, almost hesitantly, like a piece of information that could have been overlooked if it had surfaced at a different time, in a different context. By then, the investigation across Florida had already consumed months of effort, stretching resources thin, pulling investigators in multiple directions at once. Patterns had been established, theories debated, suspects considered and dismissed. What remained was a sense that the answer was close, closer than it had ever been, but still just beyond reach. The turning point began, as many do, with something seemingly small. One of the victim's vehicles, recovered earlier in the investigation, had been processed thoroughly at the time. Standard procedure had been followed, fingerprints lifted, surfaces examined, items catalogued. But like many pieces of evidence in a complex case, its significance had not been fully realized immediately. It sat within the broader collection of findings, important but not yet definitive. It was the fingerprints that changed everything. Advancements in database comparison, combined with renewed attention to existing evidence, led to a match. Not a perfect, immediate identification, but a lead, one that pointed toward a name that had not previously been central to the investigation. Aileen Wuornos. At first, it was just that, a name attached to a set of prints found inside a victim's car. But as investigators began to dig deeper, the fragments started to align in a way that felt different from previous leads. This was not a loose connection or a coincidence that required too many assumptions to hold together. It was tangible, traceable. They began to build a profile around that name. Her history surfaced quickly, revealing a life that intersected with many of the elements already present in the case. Transience, instability, a pattern of moving through the same environments where the victims had last been seen. Arrest records, minor offenses, indications of a life lived on the margins. And then there were the witness accounts. Descriptions that had once seemed inconsistent or peripheral began to take on new clarity. The blonde woman seen near multiple locations. The hitchhiker. The sex worker. The figure who had appeared and disappeared without drawing sustained attention. Now, those descriptions had a possible identity. The investigation shifted. What had once been a broad search, spread across multiple potential suspects, began to narrow. Resources were redirected, focus intensified. The goal was no longer just to understand the pattern, but to confirm whether this individual, this woman, was truly at the center of it. Surveillance became a priority. Tracking her movements was not straightforward. Aileen Wuornos did not operate within predictable routines. She moved frequently, stayed in different locations, relied on a network of temporary connections rather than fixed addresses. But she was not entirely invisible. Investigators began to identify places she had been known to frequent: motels, bars, roadside stops. Locations where her presence, while not constant, had been noted often enough to establish a pattern. At the same time, they looked into her relationships. One connection stood out. A woman who had been close to her, someone who had shared time, space, and experiences during the period in question. This relationship became a focal point, not just because of its proximity, but because it represented a potential avenue for information that went beyond physical evidence. Approaching that connection required care. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild, and in a case like this, the stakes were high. Investigators needed cooperation, but they also needed accuracy. The information provided had to be reliable, not influenced by fear, loyalty, or external pressure. Conversations were initiated. At first, they were cautious, measured. Questions framed in a way that allowed for openness without immediate confrontation. But as the dialogue continued, details began to emerge, small at first, then more substantial. Statements that suggested knowledge of the crimes. References to actions, to admissions, to moments where the line between suspicion and confirmation began to blur. This was the shift investigators had been waiting for. For the first time, there was not just circumstantial evidence or inferred connections, but direct implication. A narrative, however incomplete, that placed Aileen Wuornos at the center of the events they had been trying to piece together. The challenge now was to solidify that narrative. Evidence had to be corroborated, statements verified, timelines aligned. It was not enough to suspect, they needed to prove. Each element had to withstand scrutiny, not just in the context of the investigation, but in the courtroom that would inevitably follow. The pressure intensified. Time, which had once felt like an obstacle due to the delay in identifying a suspect, now became a factor in a different way. The longer it took to act, the greater the risk of losing track, of evidence becoming less reliable, of the suspect moving beyond their reach. The decision was made. An arrest would be pursued. When it happened, it was not dramatic in the way such moments are often portrayed. There was no high-speed chase, no public confrontation that drew immediate attention. It was controlled, deliberate, executed with the understanding that the person they were taking into custody was believed to be responsible for multiple acts of lethal violence. Aileen Wuornos was detained. In that moment, the investigation entered a new phase. The focus shifted from identification to confirmation, from gathering external evidence to confronting the individual at the center of it all. Interrogations would follow, conversations that would attempt to bridge the gap between what was known and what remained uncertain. Inside those interrogation rooms, the dynamic changed again. No longer was she a distant figure, moving through the shadows of the case. She was present, visible, a person whose expressions, words, and silences would be analyzed in detail. Her responses did not provide immediate clarity. At times, she appeared cooperative, offering accounts that aligned, at least partially, with the evidence. At other moments, her statements shifted, introducing inconsistencies that complicated the narrative. The claim of self-defense emerged early, framing her actions within a context that challenged the straightforward interpretation of the crimes. Each statement had to be evaluated carefully. What was consistent? What changed? What could be verified independently? The process was meticulous, often slow. Investigators cross-referenced her accounts with physical evidence, with timelines, with witness statements. Some details matched. Others did not. But the overall trajectory pointed in one direction. The pattern that had once been abstract, defined by scattered scenes and disconnected clues, now had a focal point. The name that had emerged from a set of fingerprints was no longer just a lead, it was the center of the case. The breakthrough had not solved everything. There were still questions about motive, about the precise sequence of events in each incident, about the extent to which her claims of self-defense could be substantiated or challenged. But the fundamental uncertainty, the question of who, had been answered. And with that answer came a different kind of weight. Because identifying the person responsible does not undo what has been done. It does not restore the lives that were lost or erase the impact on those left behind. What it does is provide a path forward, a way to move from investigation to accountability. As Aileen Wuornos sat in custody, the case that had once seemed fragmented began to coalesce into something more defined, more structured. The pieces that had been scattered across highways and wooded areas, across reports and witness statements, were being assembled into a narrative that could be presented, challenged, and ultimately judged. The breakthrough had come. Not as a single moment of clarity, but as a convergence of evidence, persistence, and the gradual narrowing of possibilities. And from that point on, the story would no longer be about finding the person responsible. It would be about understanding what that responsibility meant. The courtroom did not feel like the highways. There was no open space, no shifting horizon, no anonymity in motion. Everything here was contained, deliberate, observed. The air itself seemed different, conditioned, still, carrying the quiet weight of expectation. Where the roads had offered distance and disappearance, this room demanded presence. It demanded answers. At the center of it all sat Aileen Wuornos, no longer a figure moving between shadows, but a person fixed in place, visible from every angle that mattered. The transformation was stark. The same woman who had once stood at the edges of highways, signaling to passing cars, now faced a system designed to slow everything down, to examine every detail with precision. The proceedings unfolded in stages, each one building on the last, each one shaping how the story would be understood not just by those in the room, but by the public beyond it. The prosecution began by constructing a narrative of intent. They did not present the events as isolated acts of desperation or moments of uncontrollable fear. Instead, they framed them as a pattern, deliberate, repeated, and consistent. The evidence, they argued, pointed toward a series of decisions made with clarity, not confusion. They walked through the timeline methodically. 7 victims. Multiple locations across Florida. Each encounter following a similar structure: contact along the highway, movement to a more isolated setting, the use of a firearm, the removal of personal belongings. They presented forensic findings, ballistics reports that linked the shootings, physical evidence recovered from vehicles, details that reinforced the idea of a single perpetrator acting across multiple incidents. Each piece was introduced carefully, explained in terms that connected it to the larger picture. Witnesses were called. Investigators described the process of connecting the cases, the gradual recognition of a pattern, the steps that led to identifying Aileen Wuornos as a suspect. They spoke of the fingerprints found in one of the victims' vehicles, of the corroborating statements that followed, of the alignment between her known movements and the timeline of the crimes. There was an emphasis on consistency. Consistency in method. Consistency in outcome. Consistency that, in the prosecution's view, could not be explained by coincidence or isolated self-defense. Then came the question of motive. The prosecution pointed to the theft of property, cars, money, items of value as evidence that these acts were not purely defensive. They argued that the killings facilitated robbery, that the removal of victims' belongings was not incidental but intentional. It was a narrative that framed the violence as purposeful, controlled, and ultimately criminal in the most direct sense. But the defense told a different story. They did not deny that the killings had occurred. Instead, they focused on the context in which those acts took place. They brought the attention back to the life that had preceded the crimes, to the experiences that had shaped Aileen Wuornos long before she ever stood in that courtroom. They spoke of instability, of abuse, of a childhood marked by neglect and violence. They painted a picture of someone who had learned, from an early age, that the world was not a safe place, that danger was not theoretical but immediate. This was not presented as an excuse, but as an explanation. They argued that her perception of threat was shaped by those experiences, that the environment she lived in working as a sex worker along isolated highways placed her in situations where violence was a real and present risk. And within that context, they introduced the central claim: self-defense. According to the defense, the encounters that led to the shootings were not controlled or premeditated in the way the prosecution described. They were volatile, unpredictable, escalating in ways that left little room for measured response. They argued that in those moments, she believed her life was in danger, that her actions were driven by a need to survive rather than a desire to kill. To support this, they examined her statements, the accounts she had given during interrogation. They highlighted the elements that suggested fear, that described aggression from the victims, that framed each incident as a reaction to immediate threat. But this narrative faced its own challenges. The prosecution countered by pointing to inconsistencies in her statements, to changes in detail that raised questions about reliability. They emphasized the number of victims, the repetition of the pattern, the actions taken after each killing, particularly the theft and disposal of evidence. They argued that self-defense, by its nature, is situational, reactive. It does not typically repeat in the same structured way across multiple incidents involving different individuals. The courtroom became a space where these two interpretations collided. On one side, a narrative of calculated violence. On the other, a narrative of survival under threat. The jury was tasked with navigating that collision, weighing evidence against explanation, fact against interpretation. As the trial progressed, the emotional weight of the case became more apparent. Family members of the victims were present, their reactions restrained but visible. The loss they carried was not abstract. It was immediate, personal, tied to the individuals they had known beyond the details presented in court. For them, the question of motive did not change the outcome. The absence remained the same. At the same time, there were moments when attention shifted back to Aileen Wuornos herself. Her demeanor, her expressions, the way she responded to the proceedings, all of it was observed, interpreted, sometimes speculated upon. There were instances where she appeared composed, even detached. Others where tension surfaced, where the strain of the situation became more visible. The trial was not just about what had happened. It was about how those events would be understood, categorized, and judged within the framework of the law. When the time came for closing arguments, both sides distilled their positions into their most direct forms. The prosecution emphasized accountability. 7 lives taken. A pattern that pointed to intent. Evidence that, in their view, left little room for doubt. The defense emphasized context. A life shaped by violence. A reality where danger was constant. Actions that, they argued, were rooted in fear rather than malice. The jury deliberated. Time, once again, took on a different quality, slower, more deliberate. Outside the courtroom, the world continued, but inside, everything was focused on a decision that would define the outcome of the case. When the verdict was delivered, it carried the weight of that entire process. Guilty. The word itself was simple, but its implications were not. It affirmed the prosecution's narrative, establishing that the killings were not legally justified as self-defense, but constituted murder under the law. Sentencing followed. The severity of the crimes, the number of victims, the pattern established across multiple incidents, all of it contributed to the final decision. Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to death. The method, lethal injection, reflected the legal standards of Florida at the time, a procedure designed to carry out the sentence in a controlled, clinical manner. But even as the legal process reached its conclusion, the broader questions did not disappear. The courtroom had provided answers in a legal sense. It had determined guilt. It had assigned punishment. But the deeper complexities, the intersection of personal history, environmental factors, and individual choice remained subjects of discussion and debate. Because the story, as it had been presented, did not fit neatly into a single category. It was not purely one thing or another. And that ambiguity lingered, even as the verdict brought a formal end to the trial. In the end, the justice system had spoken. The events that had unfolded along the highways, in the confined spaces of cars and the hidden corners of the landscape, had been brought into the open, examined, and judged. But what they meant, beyond the legal definitions, beyond the structure of the trial, was something that extended beyond the walls of the courtroom, into conversations that would continue long after the sentence had been carried out. Time has a way of softening edges, but it does not erase them. Years after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, the story of Aileen Wuornos continued to exist in a space that felt unsettled, as if it resisted being placed neatly into the past. The highways of Florida remained what they had always been: long, open, indifferent, but for those who knew what had happened along certain stretches, they carried a different kind of weight. Not visible, not marked, but present. The execution, carried out in 2002, was meant to be a final point. A conclusion in the legal sense, a moment where the system completed its process and closed the case in the most definitive way it could. The procedure itself was controlled, clinical, designed to remove unpredictability. But even in that controlled environment, there was no sense of resolution that could fully encompass what had come before. Because endings like that do not resolve the questions that linger. They simply mark a boundary. On one side, the events themselves, the encounters, the violence, the investigation, the trial. On the other, the interpretation of those events, the effort to understand what they mean and why they happened the way they did. For the families of the victims, the passage of time did not diminish the absence. It changed its shape, perhaps, made it less immediate in some moments and more pronounced in others. There are milestones that never arrive the way they should, conversations that remain unfinished, the quiet, persistent awareness that something fundamental has been altered. Justice, in the form it was delivered, provided a measure of accountability. It established responsibility, affirmed that what had been taken mattered enough to warrant the most severe response available under the law. But it did not restore what had been lost. It could not. At the same time, the story of Aileen Wuornos did not disappear with her. It continued to be examined, discussed, interpreted through different lenses. In academic settings, in media portrayals, in conversations about crime and psychology, her case became a reference point, one that raised questions rather than offering simple answers. How does a life shaped by instability, neglect, and violence intersect with personal responsibility? At what point does context explain behavior, and at what point does it cease to mitigate it? These are not questions with clear boundaries. They exist in the gray areas, the spaces where certainty becomes difficult to maintain. Her claim of self-defense remains one of the most contested aspects of the case. For some, it introduces doubt, suggesting that at least some of the encounters may have involved genuine threat, that her perception of danger was not entirely unfounded given the environment she lived in. For others, the pattern of the killings, the consistency, the actions taken after each incident point toward something more deliberate, something that cannot be reconciled with a purely defensive narrative. Both perspectives draw from the same set of facts. They simply interpret them differently. This tension is part of what keeps the case alive in public consciousness. It resists closure in a way that more straightforward cases do not. There is no single narrative that fully satisfies all aspects of the story, no interpretation that resolves every contradiction. And perhaps that is the point. Because cases like this do not exist in isolation. They reflect broader realities about vulnerability, about violence, about the systems that respond to both. The world that Aileen Wuornos moved through was one where certain lives were less visible, where risks were normalized in ways that made them easier to overlook. The men who encountered her did so within a context that carried its own assumptions, its own expectations about control and consequence. When those assumptions broke down, the results were irreversible. In the years since, her story has been retold in different forms, most notably through the film Monster, where Charlize Theron portrayed her with a level of intensity that brought renewed attention to the case. The film did not claim to provide a definitive account, but it offered an interpretation, one that emphasized the emotional and psychological dimensions of her life, the complexity of her experiences. For some viewers, it humanized her in a way that challenged their initial perceptions. For others, it risked shifting focus away from the victims, from the harm that had been done. This, too, reflects the difficulty of telling stories like this. Where do you place the emphasis? How do you acknowledge complexity without diminishing responsibility? There is no single correct answer, only a series of choices that shape how the story is understood. In the field of Toy Pham Hock, her case is often studied not just for what happened, but for what it reveals about patterns of behavior, about the ways in which personal history and environment can intersect with criminal acts. It is used as an example of how atypical cases, those that do not fit established profiles, can challenge assumptions and force a re-evaluation of what is considered possible. But beyond analysis, beyond representation, there is the simpler, more difficult reality. 7 people lost their lives. Each of those lives extended beyond the moment they became part of this story. They had histories, relationships, identities that cannot be fully captured in the context of a case file or a narrative. Remembering that is essential. Because without that recognition, the story risks becoming abstract, reduced to themes and interpretations rather than grounded in the human impact that defines it. At the same time, understanding the person responsible does not require sympathy, but it does require acknowledgement of complexity. It means recognizing that actions, even the most severe, do not emerge from nothing. They are shaped by a combination of factors, some internal, some external, some within control, others not. This does not absolve responsibility. But it does complicate the narrative. And in that complication, there is a kind of truth that is uncomfortable but necessary. The story of Aileen Wuornos does not offer easy conclusions. It does not resolve into a clear moral lesson that can be neatly applied. Instead, it leaves behind a series of questions, a set of tensions that continue to exist even after the legal process has ended. Perhaps the most enduring of these is the question of how we define the line between survival and violence. At what point does the instinct to protect oneself become something else? At what point does context stop explaining and start obscuring? These are questions that extend beyond this case, into broader discussions about human behavior, about the systems that shape it, about the ways in which society responds to those who exist at its edges. As the years continue to pass, the details of the case may become less immediate for those who encounter it for the first time. The names, the dates, the specific locations may blur. But the core of the story, the collision between lives, the irreversible consequences of those encounters, remains. The highways are still there. Cars still pass through the same stretches of road, drivers making decisions in moments that feel ordinary, unaware of the history that has unfolded in those spaces. The world continues, as it always does, carrying forward both the visible and the unseen. And somewhere within that continuity, the story lingers. Not as a closed chapter, but as a reminder. That behind every case, every headline, every narrative, there are lives that cannot be reduced to a single moment. That understanding something does not mean resolving it. And that some stories, no matter how thoroughly they are examined, will always leave something unanswered. If there is one illusion this case permanently dismantles, it is the belief that violence has a single shape, a predictable origin, or a clean explanation that can be neatly contained once the facts are assembled. The story of Aileen Wuornos refuses that comfort. It sits instead in the uncomfortable space where lived experience, environment, perception, and choice collide without ever fully resolving into something simple. What happened along the highways of Florida was not just a sequence of criminal acts. It was the intersection of two realities that never truly understood each other in the moment they met. On one side, men moving through ordinary routines, carrying assumptions about control, risk, and transaction. On the other, a woman shaped by instability, moving through the same spaces with a fundamentally different understanding of threat and survival. When those perspectives collided, the outcome became irreversible. The legal system responded in the only language it has: evidence, procedure, judgment. It examined patterns, weighed testimony, reconstructed timelines, and arrived at conclusions that satisfied the requirements of law. In that framework, guilt was established, responsibility assigned, and punishment carried out. The system did what it was designed to do: it closed the case. But closure in law is not the same as closure in understanding. Even now, years later, the case continues to surface in discussions about criminal psychology, gender, violence, and the limits of self-defense. It is referenced not because it is typical, but because it is not. It disrupts expectations. It forces uncomfortable questions about how society interprets both perpetrators and victims when the boundaries between those roles become contested. The narrative of self-defense remains one of the most debated elements. Some see it as a reflection of genuine threat, shaped by an environment where danger was not hypothetical but routine. Others see it as incompatible with the pattern of repeated lethal encounters, pointing to evidence that suggests deliberation rather than immediate reaction. Both interpretations rely on the same foundation of facts, yet lead to fundamentally different understandings of intent. This tension is where the case continues to live. Not in certainty, but in disagreement. Not in resolution, but in interpretation. What is often lost in the broader retelling is the individuality of those involved. The victims are frequently discussed as a group, defined by their connection to a single perpetrator, but each of them existed as a complete life before that connection occurred. They were not defined by their final moments. They were defined by everything that came before: relationships, routines, ambitions, and ordinary days that never reached their expected conclusion. Remembering that is not a narrative device. It is a necessity. Because without it, the story becomes abstract. And abstraction makes it easier to forget the weight of what actually happened. At the same time, understanding the perpetrator does not mean simplifying or excusing the actions that were taken. It means acknowledging that human behavior does not emerge in isolation. It is shaped by accumulated experiences, by environments that reinforce certain perceptions, by moments that alter how future situations are interpreted. In the case of Aileen Wuornos, those formative experiences are often cited as part of any attempt to understand her trajectory. A childhood marked by instability, exposure to violence, and lack of sustained support created conditions that influenced how she moved through the world. Life on the margins reinforced those patterns, placing her repeatedly in situations where risk and survival were closely intertwined. None of this determines outcome in a deterministic sense. But it does provide context for how perception can be shaped over time, particularly in environments where threat is constant and trust is fragile. Still, context is not explanation. And explanation is not justification. This distinction is what makes the case so persistently difficult to categorize. The events themselves remain fixed. 7 lives lost. Multiple encounters along isolated stretches of road. A sequence of actions that the legal system ultimately defined in clear terms. But the meaning of those events continues to shift depending on the perspective from which they are examined. In popular culture, particularly through portrayals like Monster, there has been an effort to explore the psychological and emotional dimensions of her life. These interpretations do not replace legal findings, but they do add layers to public understanding. They invite viewers to consider not just what happened, but how someone arrives at a point where such actions become possible. That invitation is not comfortable. It forces confrontation with questions that do not have clean answers. How does society respond to individuals who exist outside its protective structures? How do patterns of vulnerability intersect with patterns of harm? Where does accountability end and explanation begin? These are not questions confined to this case. They extend into broader discussions about crime and justice, about how systems interpret behavior that falls outside expected norms. The story also highlights something less discussed but equally important: the role of environment in shaping opportunity. The highways, the transient spaces, the anonymity of roadside encounters, all of these elements created conditions in which interactions could occur without sustained oversight. That lack of visibility is not incidental. It is structural. It is part of how certain spaces function. Understanding that does not reduce responsibility, but it does explain how certain patterns can develop without immediate interruption. In the aftermath, what remains is not resolution, but awareness. Awareness that violence often exists at the intersection of multiple forces rather than a single cause. Awareness that legal closure does not equate to emotional or societal closure. Awareness that every case of this nature carries within it more than just the actions that define it legally. It carries histories, contexts, and consequences that extend far beyond the moment of judgment. The story of Aileen Wuornos continues to be revisited not because it offers answers, but because it resists them. It sits in the uncomfortable space where certainty dissolves into complexity, where interpretation replaces finality. And perhaps that is why it endures. Because it reminds us that understanding human behavior is rarely a matter of finding a single truth. It is a process of holding multiple truths at once, even when they do not fully align. The road still stretches across Florida, unchanged in its physical form. But for those who know its history, it carries an additional dimension, one built not of asphalt and distance, but of memory, consequence, and unanswered questions. And in that sense, the story does not end. It continues, every time it is retold, every time it is examined again, every time someone tries once more to understand what cannot be fully resolved. There is a final thing that remains after all the files are closed, all the testimony recorded, all the sentences carried out. It is not evidence. It is not law. It is the uneasy persistence of questions that refuse to disappear even when every official process has reached its conclusion. The story of Aileen Wuornos has long since moved beyond the boundaries of the courtroom and into something larger, less contained. It exists now in fragments, documentaries, academic discussions in Toy Fam Hoc, dramatizations like Monster, and in the broader cultural memory of violence along the highways of Florida. Each retelling reshapes it slightly, emphasizing different aspects, softening some edges while sharpening others. But beneath all those versions, the core remains unchanged. 7 men went out onto the road and never returned alive. 1 woman was held responsible for those deaths. And between those 2 facts lies an entire landscape of interpretation that has never fully settled. What makes this case endure is not only the brutality of what occurred, but the instability of how it is understood. It resists final categorization. It refuses to remain fixed in a single moral frame. For some, it is a clear example of calculated violence. For others, it is inseparable from the conditions that shaped the person at its center, from a life marked by abandonment, instability, and constant exposure to danger. Neither interpretation fully cancels the other. They exist side by side, in tension. That tension is where the case continues to live. In examining it, one is forced to confront a difficult reality about human behavior, that the same set of actions can be read through multiple lenses without any single one achieving complete dominance. The law requires certainty. Narrative does not. This is why the story continues to be retold. Because certainty, in this case, was procedural rather than existential. The legal system concluded its work by determining guilt and assigning consequence. That conclusion is final in the only sense that matters within its structure. But outside that structure, in the space where meaning is constructed rather than declared, the conversation remains open. There is also the matter of perception. Over time, public understanding of cases like this shifts. Early coverage often simplifies, reducing complexity into recognizable archetypes. As years pass, those archetypes are challenged by deeper analysis, by personal accounts, by attempts to reconstruct context more fully. In this process, figures like Aileen Wuornos become symbols that carry different meanings depending on who is interpreting them. To some, she represents danger misunderstood. To others, she represents accountability without ambiguity. To many, she represents something more uncomfortable, the possibility that both readings contain partial truth. The victims, meanwhile, risk being flattened by the weight of that discourse. Their individuality can be overshadowed by the focus on the perpetrator and the psychological complexity surrounding her actions. Yet each of them lived lives that extended far beyond the moment they entered this narrative. Their absence is not theoretical. It is lived, by families, friends, and communities that continue forward without them. This imbalance is one of the quieter tragedies of such cases. The way attention concentrates, and how easily it can drift away from those who are no longer present to reclaim their own stories. There is also the question of environment, which remains central even after the legal resolution. The highways of Florida are not just settings. They are active conditions within the narrative. They allow for movement without permanence, interaction without continuity, and disappearance without immediate trace. In such spaces, encounters can happen quickly and dissolve just as fast, leaving behind only fragments that must later be reconstructed. Understanding this does not reduce accountability, but it does clarify how certain patterns become possible. It explains why detection was delayed, why connections were not immediately made, why multiple incidents could occur before a coherent picture emerged. It is in these structural conditions that the story gains its broader relevance. Because it is not only about one individual or one series of events. It is about how systems of movement, vulnerability, and anonymity intersect in ways that can produce outcomes no single participant fully anticipates. Even now, decades later, the case continues to be referenced in discussions of criminal behavior not because it provides resolution, but because it complicates it. It forces a confrontation with ambiguity that many cases do not sustain. It does not allow for easy categorization into familiar narratives of pure villainy or simple victimhood. Instead, it exists in a space where those categories blur. And that blur is precisely what makes it difficult to forget. In the end, what remains is not a conclusion that satisfies every perspective, but a set of truths that coexist uneasily. That violence occurred. That lives were lost. That responsibility was assigned through legal judgment. And that understanding, beyond judgment, remains incomplete. The road continues to stretch across Florida, unchanged in its physical form, indifferent to the history layered upon it. Cars still pass through the same corridors where earlier events unfolded, most unaware of what took place there. But for those who do know, the road is no longer just a route. It is a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary movement, there are stories that resist closure, narratives that remain active long after their final recorded moment. And in that persistence lies the final, unresolved truth of this case, that some stories do not end with a verdict or an execution. They continue, reshaped by memory, interpretation, and the ongoing effort to understand what, in the end, may never be fully contained within a single explanation. There are cases that close, and there are cases that linger not in the legal sense, but in the way they continue to echo through conversations, studies, and memory long after the official record has been sealed. The story of Aileen Wuornos belongs firmly to the second category. Even after the sentence was carried out in 2002 in Florida, the case did not settle into silence. Instead, it dispersed. Into academic papers. Into documentaries. Into debates that continue to circle the same core questions without ever fully exhausting them. What was she? A product of circumstance or an agent of calculated violence? A woman reacting to immediate threat or someone who had crossed a line into something far more deliberate? The difficulty is that the answers depend heavily on where one chooses to stand when looking at the evidence. From one angle, the pattern is difficult to ignore. Multiple victims. Repeated use of a firearm. A consistent method of engagement along isolated highways. The removal of personal property after each incident. These elements, taken together, form a structure that resembles intent more than chaos, sequence more than accident. In this reading, the events are not isolated reactions but part of a continuous trajectory. From another angle, however, the context cannot be dismissed so easily. A life marked by instability from early childhood. Exposure to violence and neglect. Years spent in environments where vulnerability was not theoretical but constant. A world in which encounters on the roadside carried genuine and immediate risk. In this framing, the same actions begin to look different, not excused, but situated within a reality where perception of danger may have been shaped long before any of these encounters occurred. Both perspectives rely on the same facts. Neither can fully erase the other. This is why the case persists in criminology discussions within Toy Fam Hoc. It does not fit neatly into established typologies. It challenges expectations about gender and violence, about the boundaries of self-defense, about how serial offenses are typically profiled. Cases like this force a reconsideration of assumptions that are often treated as stable. But beyond academic analysis, there is another layer that remains more difficult to process: the human residue of the events. 7 men lost their lives in a series of encounters that, at the time, likely felt ordinary to them at first. Brief interactions along a road, moments that did not initially signal their finality. Each of them had a life that extended far beyond the moment they entered this narrative. Families, routines, plans that were never completed. Those details are often overshadowed by the scale of the case, but they remain central to its reality. On the other side, the life of Aileen Wuornos has been repeatedly examined as an attempt to understand how such outcomes became possible. Not to reduce responsibility, but to trace the conditions that shaped perception, decision-making, and response to perceived threat. Her existence on the margins of society, particularly within the transient spaces of roadside economies, placed her in a constant state of uncertainty. That environment does not determine action, but it does influence how risk is interpreted in the moment. The intersection of those two trajectories, hers and the victim's, is where the case becomes irreversible. It is also where interpretation becomes most fragile. Because what happened in those moments between contact and consequence cannot be fully reconstructed. There are accounts, there is physical evidence, there are patterns. But there is no complete, shared record of those encounters as they unfolded in real time. That absence creates space for competing narratives, each attempting to fill in what cannot be directly observed. Over time, cultural representations have added additional layers. Films like Monster have attempted to portray not only the events but the emotional and psychological landscape surrounding them. These interpretations are not neutral reproductions of fact, they are constructions that emphasize certain dimensions while minimizing others. In doing so, they shape how the broader public engages with the case, often blurring the line between understanding and reinterpretation. This is part of why the story remains active in public discourse. It resists final ownership. No single narrative fully contains it. Even the legal outcome, which established guilt and concluded proceedings, does not resolve the interpretive tension. Law can determine responsibility within its own framework, but it does not settle the broader questions about causation, context, or meaning. Those remain outside its scope. As years pass, what becomes most apparent is not resolution, but persistence. The persistence of unanswered questions. The persistence of competing interpretations. The persistence of a case that continues to be revisited not because it is unresolved in a legal sense, but because it is unresolved in a human one. Perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand it. Not as a closed chapter, but as a set of events that continue to generate meaning depending on how they are approached. Each retelling emphasizes different elements, each analysis highlights different truths, and no single version fully eliminates the need for the others. The highways remain, unchanged in structure. The landscape of Florida continues to move forward, indifferent to what once occurred along its edges. Life proceeds, as it always does, carrying with it both memory and oblivion in uneven measure. And within that continuity, the case persists not as an endpoint, but as an ongoing question about violence, vulnerability, and the limits of understanding human behavior when circumstances collide in ways that cannot be neatly predicted. In the end, there is no final explanation that fully settles the story of Aileen Wuornos. There is only the recognition that some cases do not conclude with clarity. They conclude with complexity. And that complexity is what remains. If there is a final layer to the story of Aileen Wuornos, it is not found in the courtroom, nor in the evidence files, nor even in the later interpretations that continue to circulate through media and academic discussion. It is found in the uncomfortable realization that the case does not end where people expect it to end. It does not resolve into a single meaning that satisfies every perspective. Instead, it fractures into legal truth, psychological interpretation, cultural narrative, and human consequence. Even now, years after the last official record closed, the events along the highways of Florida remain suspended between explanation and ambiguity. The facts are known in outline: multiple encounters, multiple deaths, a consistent pattern of violence, and a final legal judgment that defined responsibility within the structure of law. But beneath that structure lies something less stable, something that continues to resist simplification. Because the central tension of this case has never truly changed. It sits in the space between two competing understandings of the same reality. On one side, a sequence of actions that appear deliberate, repeated, and consistent with intent. On the other, a life shaped by instability, exposure to violence, and a persistent sense of threat that may have influenced how each moment was perceived. Neither side fully erases the other. And that is where the discomfort begins. In Toi Pham Hoc, the case is often revisited not because it offers resolution, but because it disrupts expectations. It challenges assumptions about how offenders are typically categorized, about how victimization and agency can overlap in ways that are difficult to separate cleanly. It forces a confrontation with the idea that human behavior, especially under extreme conditions, does not always conform to predictable patterns. Yet academic analysis can only go so far. Beyond theory lies the human weight of what occurred. 7 men whose lives ended abruptly in encounters that, at the time, may not have seemed extraordinary. Each of them existed outside the context of the case before it became part of their story. They had routines, relationships, and futures that were never realized. Those details are often overshadowed by the structure of the narrative that followed, but they remain essential to understanding the full scope of what was lost. On the other side of that same story stands a life marked by instability from its earliest stages. The experiences attributed to Aileen Wuornos' abandonment, exposure to violence, life on the margins do not explain the outcome in a deterministic way, but they form part of the context in which perception and decision-making developed. They help explain why certain environments carried different meanings for her than they might for others. But explanation is not the same as justification. And this distinction is where the narrative becomes most difficult to hold in a single frame. The legal system, by necessity, must draw that line. It must determine responsibility, assign consequence, and bring a sense of closure to the procedural aspect of harm. In this case, it did so clearly. The verdict established guilt, and the sentence was carried out according to law. In that sense, the system completed its function. But closure in law does not equal closure in understanding. The public memory of the case demonstrates this clearly. Over time, representations have shifted, particularly through works like Monster, which attempt to explore the psychological and emotional dimensions behind the events. Such portrayals do not replace the facts, but they reinterpret them, emphasizing different aspects of the same reality. Some focus on empathy, others on accountability, and still others on the structural conditions that shaped the environment in which the events occurred. Each interpretation reveals something. None of them captures everything. This multiplicity is part of why the case continues to be discussed. It does not settle into a single moral category. It does not resolve into a simple lesson about good and evil, victim and perpetrator. Instead, it remains suspended in a space where multiple truths coexist without fully merging. The roads themselves remain unchanged. The highways of Florida continue to stretch across the landscape, indifferent to the history layered upon them. Cars pass through the same corridors where earlier events unfolded, most drivers unaware of what once occurred in those spaces. The physical world moves forward without acknowledgement of the narratives attached to it. But human memory does not operate that way. It retains, re-examines, reframes. And in that process, the case continues to live not as an active investigation, not as an unresolved legal matter, but as a persistent question about how violence is understood, how responsibility is assigned, and how context interacts with action. Perhaps the most important realization is that this case does not offer a conclusion that can satisfy every dimension of inquiry. It offers instead a set of intersecting truths that remain in tension with one another. Legal truth, psychological interpretation, lived experience, and moral judgment do not align neatly here. They overlap, but they do not merge. That is why the story continues to be revisited. Not because it is unfinished in a factual sense, but because it remains unfinished in an interpretive one. And in that unfinished space, the case of Aileen Wuornos continues to exist not as a resolved narrative, but as a reminder that some events resist final definition, no matter how thoroughly they are examined.